What do you do when a mountain becomes your enemy's last fortress and you finally find a way to walk right through it? That question was answered on the night of June 11th, 2026, not with words, not with a warning, with a 5,000-pound bomb that found the room Iran spent 4 decades building to be unfindable. And what happened in the hours after that strike may be the most chaotic, confusing, and consequential sequence of events in this entire conflict. Before we go any further, if you care about understanding what's actually happening in the world right now, not the headlines, not the talking points, but the real story underneath, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. Share this video with one person who's trying to make sense of all this. And if you stay until the end, I promise you'll see this conflict in a completely different way. Now let's get into it. Iran did not hide its missiles underground because it was scared. It did it because it was smart. For decades, Iran's military planners looked at what American air power could do, the precision strikes, the cruise missiles, the stealth bombers, and they made a calculated decision. If you go deep enough, if you put enough rock and reinforced concrete between your assets and the sky, you become untouchable. That was the theory. And for a long time, it worked. The complex south of Isfahan was not a storage shed, it was a masterpiece of military engineering. Iranian engineers spent 40 years carving tunnels and chambers into mountain rock. Not on the surface where satellites can see everything, not on launch ramps where reconnaissance aircraft can track movement in real time. Deep inside the earth, the chambers were reinforced. The entrances were hidden, blended into the rock face at locations chosen specifically because nobody would think to look there. Multiple entry and exit points meant that even if one was compromised, the facility lived on. The operational logic was elegant. Store the missile underground. When the moment comes, wheel it out to a prepared position, fire it, and get the launcher back inside the mountain before any counterstrike can reach it. The targeting cycle for a reactive strike takes time. The Iranians knew that. They built their entire doctrine around that window of time. By the time an intelligence analyst has confirmed a launch and a targeting solution has been produced and a strike package is on its way, the mountain has already swallowed the launcher back up. The missile is gone. The facility survives. You're left striking rock. And it worked. Before the night of June 11th, the Isfahan complex had absorbed nearly 20 separate bunker buster strikes. B-2s dropped on it. B-52s dropped on it. F-15s dropped on it. And the morning after every single one of those strikes, missiles were still rising from those mountains. The mountain was winning. Each previous weapon reached deep, but not deep enough. The most protected chambers sat at depths and behind concrete thicknesses that previous penetrating munitions could damage but not reliably destroy in a single pass. Iran's engineers knew exactly where that threshold was. They built to it deliberately. A missile complex that can take a hit and keep functioning is not a deficiency in Iranian planning. It is the plan. It is the whole point. And for decades, that plan held. Then came the GBU-72. This weapon did not exist in its current operational form when this conflict began. That matters. It matters because it tells you this weapon was not sitting in a warehouse waiting for a war. It was being developed specifically because someone in the American defense establishment looked at Iran's underground doctrine and decided the answer was not to find a bigger bomb. The answer was to find a smarter one. Here is the precise problem the GBU-72 was built to solve. Previous bunker busters, including the GBU-28 that American forces had been using throughout this conflict, can penetrate significant depths, but they detonate too early. By the time the bomb is punched through the outer layers of rock and concrete, the casing has been deformed by the impact. The fuse triggers. The explosion happens at a depth that damages the facility's outer structure, but doesn't reach the inner chambers where the real assets are kept. Iran's engineers understood this physics. They built their deepest facilities based on it. The GBU-72 was engineered to go past that point. The casing is hardened to maintain its structural integrity through the initial impact, through the reinforced concrete, through the packed rock, through all of it, without deforming. It doesn't detonate on impact. It keeps traveling. And then a delayed fuse system activates at the depth where the facility's critical infrastructure actually sits. The bomb doesn't try to destroy the mountain from outside. It travels through the mountain to find the room that the mountain was built to protect. On the night of June 11th, it found the room. The footage that circulated across defense monitoring networks that night showed something Iran had spent billions of dollars and 4 decades trying to prevent. The mountain south of Isfahan lit up from the inside. Not a surface impact, not a crater on the rock face. From within, secondary explosions followed, munitions stored inside a sealed underground space, detonating in sequence, pressure building with nowhere to go. That chain reaction tells you exactly what was in the room. Those weren't echoes, those were inventory. The guidance system on the GBU-72 is worth understanding because it's what makes this weapon usable in contested airspace, not just on a test range. It can be loaded with pre-planned GPS coordinates before the F-15E even takes off, but it can also be updated in real time by the weapon systems officer in the rear seat as the aircraft closes on the target. Sensor data gathered during the approach can refine the aim point in the final moments before release. And if the laser designation is interrupted, if the aircraft has to maneuver hard because an air defense system is tracking it, the weapon doesn't go dumb. It reverts to the last confirmed laser designation point and uses that as its updated GPS target. Interruption doesn't defeat it, it adapts. This matters in the airspace over Isfahan because Iran still has surviving air defense elements in the region. The delivery aircraft is not flying into a sanitized environment. It is flying into a contested space where the enemy is actively trying to track and engage it. The GBU-72's guidance architecture was built with that reality in mind, and the delivery platform was already in the theater. This was not a B-2 flying from Missouri. F-15E Strike Eagles can operate from forward bases at flight times of 30 to 45 minutes from the Isfahan target area. The logistics are not a strategic operation. They are a tactical one. A pair of aircraft, a weapon that already knows where it's going, a mountain that is about to find out it was never as safe as it believed. Now, here is where this story gets genuinely complicated, because 5 hours after that mountain lit up from the inside, Donald Trump posted on Truth Social that a deal had been approved at the highest levels of Iranian leadership and would be signed that weekend. And then Iranian factions publicly stated that nothing had been signed and no agreement existed. And simultaneously, the IRGC Navy declared the Strait of Hormuz closed to all vessels. And then, within hours of that declaration, Iranian drones were fired at Indian commercial ships transiting the strait. And American naval and air forces shot both drones into the water before they reached anything. And hundreds of ships continued transiting the strait in real time. All of that happened inside a single operational day. Take a moment and let that sequence settle, because the chaos is the message. Trump's Truth Social post contained language that deserves careful reading. He wrote that the terms Iran leaked to media had nothing to do with what was agreed in writing. He wrote that Iran's statement about a deal bore no relation to the truth. And then he wrote something more significant than either of those. He wrote that there is no such thing as dealing in good faith with them. Read that precisely. Not that a specific negotiation failed. Not that a particular proposal was rejected. There is no such thing as dealing in good faith with them. That is a structural judgment about the Iranian negotiating approach as a whole. It is the conclusion of an administration that has watched Iranian civilian diplomats submit proposals while the IRGC attacks ships, announce deals that IRGC factions immediately contradict, and leak terms to media that don't match what was discussed in the room. The drone attack detail in that same post is equally important. The drones targeted Indian ships, not American ships, Indian ships. India is not a party to this conflict. India has maintained diplomatic neutrality throughout the Iranian-American confrontation. India is one of the largest consumers of oil transiting the Strait of Hormuz, and the IRGC sent attack drones at Indian commercial vessels in the same 24-hour window where Iranian diplomatic intermediaries were telling Qatari negotiators that a deal was close. The U.S. Navy and Air Force intercepted both drones. The ships kept moving, but the attack itself against a non-combatant nation's vessels during a period when Iranian diplomats were describing imminent resolution, tells you something precise about the gap between what the civilian diplomatic apparatus says and what the IRGC's operational commanders actually do. These are not two branches of the same decision-making tree. They are two separate organisms operating on separate logic with separate chains of authority. That gap is the real problem, and it is not a problem that good faith negotiating solves. Now, if you've made it this far, you clearly want to understand the full picture, not the version that gets packaged for 15-second clips. Do something simple. Screenshot this video and send it to someone who keeps asking you what's actually happening with Iran. They'll thank you later. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now's the time. This story is moving fast, and you don't want to miss what comes next. Let's talk about the IRGC's Strait of Hormuz closure declaration, because the distance between what Iran announced and what is physically happening in that waterway has reached a level that demands direct confrontation. The IRGC Navy declared the strait closed to all vessels. Any passage, they said, would be targeted. At the same moment, hundreds of ships were moving through safe corridors established and maintained by the United States Navy and Air Force. CENTCOM confirmed it. The Secretary of Defense confirmed it. Real-time AIS tracking data, the kind that any shipping company in the world can access from a laptop, confirmed it. The strait was not closed. Ships were moving. They are still moving. Iran's closure declaration is not a military event. It is an information operation, a statement designed to tell a domestic audience, sealed off by internet blackout, that the IRGC still controls the waterway it spent decades building its entire deterrence posture around. The Iranian population receiving that message cannot see the live vessel tracking data that directly contradicts it. They receive the state media version and are expected to accept it as a description of reality. The international audience can see the satellite imagery, the tracking data, the operational reports from commercial shipping companies. For them, the closure declaration is measurably false in real time. Not debatable, not ambiguous. Quantifiable in vessels per hour transiting a waterway that Iran announced is closed. The gap between the claim and the reality is the most vivid daily illustration of the distance between what the IRGC says it can do and what it is currently capable of doing. And when those drones aimed at Indian ships get shot into the water while the ships complete their transit, the gap doesn't close, it becomes the story. Now let's zoom out to the bigger strategic picture, because the GBU 72's employment against the Isfahan complex is not just about what it destroyed on that single night, it is about what it removes from Iran's future. Iran's ballistic missile inventory at the start of this conflict sat somewhere between 2 and 3,000 operational systems across multiple range and payload categories. Based on confirmed operational data, that inventory has been reduced to approximately 10% of its pre-war level. 10% of 2 to 3,000 is still 2 to 300 potentially operational ballistic missiles. The IRGC has been rationing them carefully, launching 10 at a time, spacing salvos days apart, trying to preserve what remains for moments of maximum impact rather than burning through inventory in operations that Gulf state air defenses keep intercepting anyway. Those remaining missiles are significant, but what the Isfahan underground complex represents goes beyond current inventory. It represents reconstitution capacity, the assembly infrastructure, the production machinery, the technical tooling and specialized equipment that makes building new ballistic missiles possible. An Iran that can't launch the missiles it already has is a temporarily degraded adversary. An Iran whose production infrastructure has been destroyed at the facility level is a fundamentally different kind of problem on a fundamentally different timeline. The IRGC understands this distinction with absolute clarity. It is why the Isfahan complex gets defended with whatever air defense capability remains. It is why the IRGC accepts the diplomatic cost of making closure declarations that the entire world can see are false. The ballistic missile program is not just a weapon, it is the insurance policy for everything else. And Iran, with thousands of ballistic missiles, can protect its nuclear infrastructure through sheer volume of defensive fire. And Iran, whose production capacity has been eliminated at the manufacturing level, cannot rebuild that protection on any timeline that enables the long game the IRGC has been betting on since this conflict began. Destroying production capacity is not striking a current threat. It is removing a future capability. That is a different order of strategic action. There is also a complication worth discussing honestly. The IRGC is not passive in the face of this threat. Iran has been constructing decoy installations, bunker like structures designed to look enough like real underground facilities to attract GBU 72 strikes against empty rock. The logic is straightforward. Each GBU 72 is expensive. American inventory is finite. If you can draw that weapon toward a decoy, you defend your real assets at the cost of some geological theater. A GBU 72 detonating inside empty terrain is a GBU 72 that didn't reach the actual room. This is not a new tactic. Decoy targeting has been a feature of air defense strategy since the Second World War. What makes it consequential here is the specific weapon being deceived. The counter is the intelligence architecture that distinguishes real facilities from decoys through pattern of life analysis, thermal signatures, electromagnetic emissions, personnel movement, vehicle traffic, and months of persistent overhead surveillance. The targeting picture for the Isfahan complex was built during the ceasefire period, when American surveillance systems collected continuously while strikes paused. That accumulated intelligence is what separates a bomb that lights a mountain from the inside from one that makes a very expensive hole in empty rock. Tonight's footage indicates the targeting picture was correct. Now let's bring all three tracks together: military, diplomatic, and psychological. Because June 11th, 2026 is the day they converged in ways no previous day in this conflict had reached. The military track has moved steadily deeper since the opening night. First, radar installations, then command infrastructure, then medium hardened targets. Now the deepest and most protected layer of Iran's strategic missile ecosystem. Each night has not been a repetition. Each night has been enabled by the night before. Previous strikes removing the air defense and command infrastructure that protected deeper targets from being reached at all. The progression is deliberate, and the depth it has now achieved is the point. The financial track has been running in parallel at maximum pressure. Disabled tankers, redirected vessels, humanitarian passes, hundreds of millions of dollars in daily losses that compound without relief. Iran's economic trajectory has been downgraded by international financial institutions. Its currency has collapsed to historically catastrophic levels. None of that changed on June 11th, but the GBU 72 reaching the production infrastructure inside that mountain changes the long term calculus in a way that financial pressure alone never could. Financial pressure creates pain. Destroying production capacity removes the option of ever recovering from that pain through the path the IRGC had planned. The psychological track on June 11th told three completely different stories to three completely different audiences simultaneously. To the Iranian population behind the internet blackout, the regime is still functioning, still in control, still resisting. To the international diplomatic community, the Iranian leadership just demonstrated that it cannot make a commitment its own military will honor in the same 5 hour window the commitment was made. And to the IRGC commanders watching the Isfahan mountain light from the inside, the underground survivability doctrine that had been the bedrock assumption of Iranian strategic planning for 4 decades was just invalidated by a weapon that found the room. These three stories cannot all be true at once, and eventually, even the version told to the domestic audience runs out of mountain to hide behind. Here is the honest assessment of where the deal situation stands. Trump's announcement of an agreement approved at the highest levels of Iranian leadership is the most significant diplomatic statement since the original ceasefire framework. But the immediate contradictions from IRGC aligned factions, the continued drone attacks against commercial shipping, and the renewed Hormuz closure declaration are not background noise around a genuine agreement. They are the structural signature of a system that cannot produce a commitment its own components will respect. For a deal to be real, two conditions have to be met. First, it needs genuine authorization from the entity that actually governs Iranian military behavior, the IRGC command structure, specifically the hardline faction whose operational decisions have defined this conflict from the beginning. The civilian diplomatic apparatus that submitted documents through Qatari intermediaries does not control that entity. Second, it needs a verification mechanism that is robust enough to prevent the reconstitution the IRGC's long game depends on. And here is where the GBU 72 paradoxically makes peace more achievable, not less. An Iran whose ballistic missile production infrastructure has been destroyed at the Isfahan complex level has demonstrably less capacity to reconstitute its deterrence than it had before that mountain lit up. The deal becomes easier to verify because the capability it would be designed to constrain has already been significantly degraded. The nuclear question remains the core unresolved issue beneath everything else. The uranium question, as Trump put it, is what this ultimately comes down to. Whether the faction that authorized whatever communication Trump received actually accepted terms that addressed the nuclear infrastructure or whether the agreement excludes that layer, in the same way every previous Iranian proposal has, is the question that determines whether what was announced represents a genuine breakthrough or the latest iteration of a pattern that is repeated throughout this entire conflict. The GBU 72's continued employment suggests the American military does not believe the answer justifies pausing operations. Actions tell you more than announcements. They always do. The IRGC commanders who fired drones at Indian ships while Iranian diplomats were describing imminent resolution did not receive news of a deal and decide to attack anyway as an act of defiance. The more likely explanation is simpler and more troubling. They either didn't know the announcement was coming, didn't believe it represented any binding constraint on their operations, or made the decision to continue regardless of the diplomatic track status. All three of those explanations lead to the same conclusion. The IRGC's operational behavior is not governed by commitments made in diplomatic meetings. It is governed by what remains physically possible to do. And what remains physically possible is being reduced one mountain at a time by a weapon that found the room that was never supposed to be findable. Here is what June 11th, 2026 actually was. It was the day the underground became reachable. It was the day the geological logic Iran built its entire survivability doctrine on was tested against a weapon engineered specifically to disprove it. It was the day a diplomatic announcement and a military operation and three different information campaigns all occupied the same 24 hours and pointed in completely different directions depending on who was watching and from where. The mountain lit from inside. The chain reaction told you what was stored there. The 5 hours between that strike and Trump's deal announcement told you how compressed and complicated this moment has become. And the drones that were shot into the water while Indian ships kept sailing told you that declarations and reality are not always the same thing, and that the gap between them is the most honest measure of where this conflict actually stands. The question now is whether the faction that authorized whatever was communicated to Trump as a deal can deliver authorization that the IRGC's operational commanders recognize as binding, whether the hardline elements whose organizational identity is built around never compromising can be constrained by a leadership structure they have already shown they are willing to contradict in public in real time. If they can, then what happened on June 11th is the last night this conflict needed a GBU 72. If they can't, then the answer will come the only way the military track has ever delivered answers in this conflict. Not through announcements, not through declarations, not through posts on social media, but through the next mountain that finds out it was never as safe as it thought it was. Drop your prediction in the comments right now. Is this deal real, or is this another iteration of the pattern? Because if the last 40 years of Iranian strategic planning couldn't survive one night, the next 24 hours are going to tell us everything.